Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Accessibility Beneficial for Businesses and Society webinar, discussing the importance of the disabled community to businesses and business owners in the workplace, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and more, being hosted by the Iowa Secretary of State's Office and the Harkin Institute. My name is Ashley, and I'm the Business Services Outreach Specialist here at the Iowa Secretary of State's Office. Today's webinar topic is one that I care deeply about. I know that Daniel does as well, and I'm grateful to Daniel from the Harkin Institute for working with me to put this together, and grateful to all of you for attending. This webinar is being recorded for future use, but your name and details are hidden from other participants. The recording will be sent out to everyone that registered for the webinar today, sometime following the webinar. The recording itself will not be sent out today, but it will be sent out soon. Just so you know, we have enabled auto-generated closed captioning for this webinar today. And on the webinar recording, that closed captioning will be reviewed and corrected by me as needed. Please feel free to tell us if there is an error in something that the closed captioning says, or if it doesn't make sense, so that we can restate it. You will need to do so using the Q&A box. The chat will not work, so make sure that you use the one labeled Q&A. Speaking of Q&A, we will have a moderated Q&A portion to conclude the webinar today. So please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A chat box, and please make sure that you're using that box, again, specifically labeled Q&A. And we'll do our best to answer as many of those questions for you as possible. This webinar does qualify for 1 hour and 15 minutes of diversity continuing legal education credit, and we will provide the number for that credit at the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about this crucial subject, and now I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Pate for some remarks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Iowa Secretary of State Paul Pate, and I want to thank you for joining us for our webinar about accessibility in businesses and the workplace. As Iowa's business portal, it's important to us to connect with Iowa's business community and to help them receive the necessary resources to run successful and efficient businesses. I hope today's webinar will provide useful information for you moving forward, and I invite you to keep an eye out for future webinars on a range of business-related topics. Thank you for spending some of your valuable time with us today as we discuss accessibility in businesses and the workplace. Today's presentation by the Harkin Institute will offer a deep dive into how your business can remain inclusive and accessible to Iowans, and to offer further information on the Americans with Disabilities Act and how it applies to Iowa businesses. Senator Tom Harkin was a key champion on this legislation. He dedicated much of his career to improving opportunities for people with disabilities. We can all look to Senator Harkin for inspiration and do our part to prioritize accessibility. Thank you to the Harkin Institute for joining us to speak on the crucial work that you do. I hope you all enjoy today's presentation.
Thank you to Secretary Pate for those remarks. Now to get to our presenter today. So Daniel Van Sant is a disability rights attorney who has practiced most extensively in the areas of inclusive education, gender-based violence, and inclusive international development. He draws on his personal and professional experience with disability in leading the disability policy work at the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Citizen Engagement at Drake University. Daniel received bachelor's degrees in international relations, rhetoric, and politics from Drake University. He earned his Juris Doctorate and a Master of Science in Cultural Foundations of Education with a Certificate of Advanced Studies in Disability Studies from Syracuse University. Welcome again to Daniel, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Now I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Secretary Pate, for the introduction. I'm excited to have everyone here for today's topic. So I am going to go ahead and start sharing my screen now. And you should be able to see my slides that say accessibility beneficial for businesses and society. So I just have our agenda up here very quickly to let people sort of plan out. You all have busy days. If there's a piece that you need to step out for, or answer a call, go to the bathroom, fill up your water or your coffee, this agenda will give you a little bit of an idea of when you might want to do that. So I'll just pause here for a second so you can see some of the topics that we're going to cover today. Okay, as you can see, I have time at the end set aside for questions. I'm going to try to keep this pretty well on schedule so we have time for that. As Ashley said, if something is not understandable or it's really time sensitive to ask it at a certain time, feel free to put it in the Q&A and we'll monitor that, but otherwise know that we do have time at the end set aside for those questions. So an important note about me, as Ashley said, I am a lawyer, and so you know that we love our disclaimers and all that type of language. So I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. I cannot give you or your business entity legal advice through this presentation or otherwise. So I will be talking about some general legal principles related to disabilities, small businesses, the ADA, etc. But for all of you small business owners out there, you will want to confirm any specifics about your situation with your own legal counsel, right? A lot of the things we'll talk about today are very dependent on the type of building you're in or the type of services you provide. I just can't get that detailed in a presentation like this. So giving you some general principles for you to hopefully take forward with your own legal counsel or other resources if you have those questions. For people who are not familiar with the Harkin Institute, I wanted to give a little bit of background about us. So we were founded at Drake University in 2013 and had two goals in mind at our founding. So the first was to facilitate collaborative, high quality, nonpartisan, multidisciplinary public policy research and analysis dedicated to the areas at which Senator Harkin dedicated his career. We do work in 4 areas of public policy. So obviously people with disabilities, that's the area that I direct here at the Institute and I'm excited to talk about today. But we also have policy areas in retirement security, wellness and nutrition, and labor and employment as well. And one of our main goals is to foster active and informed citizen engagement in public decision-making and public policy through education and research that expands the knowledge base of these areas among students, scholars, and the public, which is why I'm excited to do this presentation today, so we can get some of this information out to all of you who are either an attorney or a small business owner or otherwise somehow engaged in this space. So thank you for registering and coming today and helping me meet one of our goals of our founding. I mentioned our 4 focus areas that we work on, so we have those icons up here. We are on Drake University's campus, and I can see from my office we have relays started right now, so happy Drake relays to all those who celebrate. Let me start off with just some basics of what is a disability. When you signed up for this presentation, right, you might have had ideas in your mind of what a disability looks like, who is qualified as a person with a disability, right? We sometimes rely on these stereotypes or images of thinking of disability in a certain way, but the law actually defines disability in a really, really broad manner. So in 2008, the Americans with Disabilities Act had an amendment to expand the definition of disability. So the original law was passed in 1990, and in 2008, we added some verbiage to make disability an even broader definition than it already was. And so to have a disability, you have to have one of these 3 prongs that we have listed here. And it's not an and, you just have to fit under one of any of these 3. So the first prong, which we're going to talk the most about today, is that you have a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. The second is that you have a record of such an impairment, or third, you are regarded as having such an impairment. And so we're going to talk a lot about the first prong, but I want to just develop the second 2 just so you have a little bit of information about that. So a record of an impairment is really something I think of maybe cancer that's in remission as a good example of this. You had a disability at one point in your life, and so you have a record, you have a medical record, a historical record of having an impairment at one point. So even if, let's say that I used to have cancer, it's now in remission, I'm still qualified as having a record of an impairment that would have qualified for a disability at the time. and C, being regarded as having such an impairment. To me, this is a really interesting piece of the ADA. I always kind of nerd out about this one and tell people it's like your trivia night question here. So what the regarded prong means under the ADA is that it protects people who do not have a disability, but are thought of as having a disability. So somebody mistakenly thinks you have a disability and treats you in a discriminatory way. You are protected under the ADA, even though you don't have a disability. And so I'm not aware of any other civil rights law that extends protections to people that are not members of the class it was meant to protect, right? I belong to certain categories. I'm a man, I'm white. If someone mistook my gender or mistook my race, I wouldn't have standing under those respective civil rights laws for protection because I'm not a member of a racial minority or a gender minority. But if someone mistakes a non-disabled person as having a disability, they're still protected. So I think this is just a really interesting piece of how the law works and shows that disability discrimination, or ableism as we sometimes call it, can affect people in a myriad of ways, even if they don't actually belong to the class of people that have a disability. So I just think that's really interesting. I can't see all your faces, but I'm sure you're rapidly taking notes and think that this is really exciting as well, right? Hope so. So we're going to talk a lot about this first prong, right? What is a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities? Again, this is extremely, extremely broad. So major life activities include, but are not limited to, so this is a non-exhaustive list that we've got here, of caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, working, right? A lot of those verbs that we all do every day, some without thinking. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. 2008 expanded the definition to include major life activities and major bodily functions. And so these bodily functions that are included are, or include, but are not limited to, functions of the immune system, normal cell growth, digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. So again, not an exhaustive list, but if we look at these two sections here, look at all of the different things that could qualify somebody as a person with a disability under the ADA. There's uh, a lot of these topics here, or a lot of these areas are things that we don't even necessarily think of socially or culturally necessarily as a disability. For example, I mentioned cancer earlier, right? On this slide, you'll see normal cell growth as a listed bodily function. That's where we get coverage for cancer. I can't speak for everybody, but my guess is there are a number of people who have cancer or have survived cancer who may not identify as being a person with a disability, right? They might not say, I'm disabled because I had cancer. They might otherwise think of themselves as a cancer survivor or something like that. Again, I don't know. I'm making some assumptions here, which is always kind of dangerous. But you think about a lot of people with diabetes, right? We have some of those digestive, endocrine, other functions here. Um, Not everybody that has a disability might identify or think of themselves as having a disability, but nonetheless, they are covered and protected under this law. So I really emphasize and encourage people to think of this very broadly. And there's kind of a strength in numbers aspect to this, right? If we think of all of the people that qualify under this definition, disability really swiftly goes from being a minority population to a pretty big segment of our society. And in fact, the CDC currently estimates that 27% of Americans have some type of disability based on that definition that I just went through here. My guess is that maybe this is surprising to some people. Maybe this is a larger number than you thought. But again, if you think of that really, really broad definition, all of those different categories of major life activities and bodily functions that are covered, hopefully it starts to make sense how we get to that 27% of Americans. And I think especially if I'm talking to business leaders, small businesses or business owners here, 27% becomes a really large segment of our society that is a customer base for you, right? So you all joined this presentation. I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here, but if there were any doubts about, why do I need to care about people with disabilities? It's a small number of people. I can't make all these changes for just a handful of people. If we shift our thinking to more than a quarter of our country or a quarter of our society, 27% is a pretty big consumer group that you will want to be attracting to your business. And I think importantly, I've got this chart here to the left from Johns Hopkins that goes through types of disabilities. And you'll see that the largest portion here is for mental health diagnoses, which are not always, but often invisible, something that you cannot see just by looking at somebody, right? If I look across this webinar, I can't tell by looking at somebody whether they have PTSD or bipolar disorder or even dyslexia or ADHD or anything like that. But the majority of disabilities in our country are invisible. And so I also say that because you have customers, you have neighbors, people in your community who have disabilities that you might not know. And so it's just helpful to think about everyone that has an invisible or a visible disability and think about how we can make our society, our businesses, just a little bit more inclusive. We don't always know what's going on inside people's bodies or inside people's minds. And it helps to be inclusive and accommodating for people. So again, I'm probably doing some choir preaching, but why does disability matter to businesses, to the business community, right? I mentioned 27% of the United States. If we take that globally, 3.4 billion people with a B experience a disability or are a close family member or friend of a person with a disability. And collectively, that 3.4 billion people with disabilities or their immediate family and friends have a combined spending power of 13 trillion with a T dollars. And so the global economy for disability is massive, right? $13 trillion around the globe is a huge, huge market that your business would likely want to capture, right? Whether you sell things only here in Iowa or you have an online marketplace or you ship internationally. It's a big population and a big market that you want to make sure that you're capturing. If we take this domestic back to the US, accounting for only people with disabilities themselves, so we remove the family member or the friend, disabled people in the United States alone control approximately $645 billion in disposable income. And again, that's disposable income. And so I'm guessing for those of you who are in business, right, you want to be profitable. You want to sell products. You are out there to make money. That's the purpose of running a business, right? So think about a population that has $645 billion in disposable income that you may not be reaching if your business is not accessible and inclusive of that consumer group. Moreover, there was a 2018 study from Accenture that found that inclusive companies, or companies inclusive of disability specifically, are twice as likely to have higher shareholder return, 28% higher revenue, and 30% higher profit margins than their peers who did not emphasize disability inclusion. So again, not to belabor the point too much, but disabled people are a waiting customer base for you and your business. A study in 2022 found that retailers are leaving billions of dollars, right? I mentioned $645 billion of disposable income. You're leaving billions of dollars of business on the table by not posting information about accessibility of your products or your location. 65% of disabled consumers in this study felt that their purchasing choices were limited on a daily basis by barriers. 43% of disabled consumers reported abandoning an online or in-person shopping task early due to a lack of information on accessibility. And so one of the keys is to anticipate the types of products or information that your customer with a disability would likely want to know and highlight that on your business website, the product description or the product link. Let people have access to this information. And I mean, know that your competitors are, right? We mentioned those companies that are inclusive of disability are raking in higher revenues and profit margins, and you want to join them. So think about listing that information, advertising around disability, making sure that your space is accessible. So I have to do this virtually, right? But when I'm in person, I ask people to put their hand up in the air if they're able to do that. So I can't see all of you, but I trust you're putting your physical or your virtual hand up in the air now. And put that virtual hand down if you have listened to an audiobook sometime in the last week, let's say. And I'll assume there's a handful of hands going down. Anyone who used electric toothbrush this morning to brush their teeth, I'd put my hand down here. Oh, I see some actual virtual hands coming up. Thank you, everybody. Anyone who has used speech to text or voice recognition apps, if you talked at Siri or your Google HomePod or Alexa or things like that, this one should get all of the hands, right? If you used a typewriter or a keyboard includes on your phone, your tablet, your computer, right? I probably used 3 different keyboards this morning before I sat down to do this presentation. Um, if you have OXO brand grips and kitchen tools, if you used a curb cut, fidget spinners, bendy straws, I'll start to go through these a little bit faster. Um, so if you haven't guessed, every one of these inventions that I just listed here is a product of disability. So it was either invented by an ally or by a disabled person. Um, and so what I think about is think of some of these products that you now use every day that came from disability. And whether you have a disability or not, or whether you think about these things or not, these products have made your life easier. And from the company's standpoint, right, the companies that captured these goods we're able to make quite a bit of money, right? If we think about some of our technology companies that have included disability, right? Siri with Apple, right? A lot of people know what a Philips Sonicare toothbrush is, right? Companies that capture that disability innovation are profitable. You're missing out on some of these great inventions if you don't include disability in your workplace. So we're going to cut now. Hopefully if you needed convincing, hopefully I've convinced you that your business should be engaging more with the disability community. And we'll talk a little bit about the ADA and what that actually looks like for you on the ground as a business owner or professional engaging with disability. So the ADA I mentioned was first passed in 1990. And so I always like to pause there and have us just think about what that means historically, right? So the ADA is only 34 years old, which is not very long when we think about the history of our country and providing civil rights to with the largest minority group in our country, right? Imagine 27% of our country not having civil rights and equal protections 35 years ago, because that's the condition that we were in. So I think it's important to always place us in that history, just to think about that disability rights movement and how far we have come, and also how far we need to go, right? So the ADA guarantees that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everybody else. It's not to give extra, it's not to give something bonus. It's really just to bring the playing field up to an accessible level for everybody. And it prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in all area of public life, including employment, schools, transportation, public-private places that are open to the general public. So you see I have 4 titles of the ADA listed out here. Title 1 is employment, Title 2 is state and local government, Title 3 is public accommodations, Title 4 is telecommunications. Today, I'm really going to focus on Title 1, employment, and Title 3, public accommodations, because my assumption is you are an employer or you are a public place of accommodation. You are a small business owner or a business owner. So Title 1 and Title 3 are what I'm going to focus on today. Right, I'm here working with the Secretary of State's office, which would fall under Title 2 as a state or local government, but I can talk to them later. I know Secretary Pate does some really great things around voting accessibility in our state, so I'll focus today for you small business owners on Title 1 and Title 3. So Title I is employment, as I mentioned. And so Title I covers employment discrimination of disabled people. I would say importantly, but sadly, Title I of the ADA, and I'll say exclusively Title I, is limited to places of employment with 15 or more employees. So for some of you that have 15 or fewer than 15, I should say, please don't think of this as a you get to discriminate or that's encouraging. This was a sacrifice or a compromise that was made in passing the law for small businesses. But if you have ambitions of someday having 15 or more employees, or maybe you already have 15 or more, right, you're going to want to think about these next couple steps here. So the ADA prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities. And again, another interesting tidbit here, or at least interesting to me, is that it also protects you if you don't have a disability but are related to a person with a disability. So again, an example of this would be, let's say that I don't have any disability, but I have a spouse or a child with a disability, and somehow that's public knowledge, right? I live in a really small town and people know, or you've done a background check on me when I apply for a job and you see something, in social media or in the news or something that I have a family member with a disability. If I come to you and apply for a job and you're sitting there reviewing resumes and you see Daniel and you think, oh, well, isn't that the guy who has that kid with that condition? I don't know if we should hire him because he'll probably be taking a lot of sick leave to take care of his kid, or they might have to travel for appointments. You also can't do that under the ADA. So in that hypothetical, right, I as a non-disabled father would still be protected for discrimination if it was based on my relationship to my child with a disability. So again, I just have to give a lot of admiration to Senator Harkin and the people who drafted this legislation to know that disability discrimination will affect you even if you are not the person who has the disability. And again, I'm not aware of other civil rights protections that would work the same way um, based on race or other identities that people can have. So it's just an interesting way that we've included that into the ADA. I mentioned that it protects discrimination against qualified individuals with a disability. So we have to think about what is a qualified individual, right? So we take our three-prong ADA definition that we went over a little while ago, and now it's not enough that you have a disability. That's our first step, that you meet one of those three prongs. But are you a qualified person with a disability? And so what does qualified mean when it comes to doing this work? So a person with a disability is qualified to perform the work if they meet the skill, experience, education, or other requirements of an employment position, and who can perform the essential functions of the position with or without reasonable accommodations. Um, so essential function is another important piece here, because there are some functions, right, that we see listed in job descriptions all the time that maybe a position does incidentally or from time to time, but is not an essential function of what you're hiring for. So you really have to make sure that you're looking at what are the real functions that this job will be performing? What do you need this person to do? And if a qualified person with a disability can perform those essential functions, with or without accommodations, reasonable accommodations, then they're qualified. Um, and so if the individual is qualified to perform the essential job functions, except for limitations by disability, you have to consider whether they could perform them with a reasonable accommodation. And so, as you might have guessed, we want to talk about what is a reasonable accommodation. This is language that you've likely heard before, but I want to go through some examples here. So reasonable accommodation, these are just some examples here, but again, it's going to be a applicant by applicant or position by position, um, individualized evaluation here. So it could be making existing facilities accessible. It could be restructuring a job, modifying a work schedule, acquiring or modifying equipment, providing readers or interpreters, modifying examinations, training, other programs. Reasonable accommodations may also include reassigning a current employee to a vacant position for which they're qualified if they become disabled and are unable to do their original job. So if you have an employee who's not disabled and becomes disabled at some point, it might be reasonable to assign them to another position that they're qualified for inside your organization rather than terminating them or letting them go. Um, However, there's no obligation to find a position for an applicant who's not qualified for the position sought, right? I mentioned the ADA is not about giving disabled people something extra. It's about equalizing the playing field here. So employers are not required to lower quality or quantity standards in order to make an accommodation. Employers also don't have to provide personal use items like glasses or hearing aids that the individual would be using, whether they're at the workplace or at home or anywhere else. Um, Sometimes I get this question of, well, aren't accommodations expensive? Isn't it cheaper to hire somebody without a disability because they don't have these things? And the answer is not really. So a 2023 study recently here from the Department of Labor found that out of the 720 employers who provided cost information in this study, just under, I mean, like point, right, 0.6% under half of the group, 49.4% said that the accommodations needed by their employees cost nothing. So right away, we have half of the accommodations provided cost $0. Another 312 or 43% had a one-time cost, and only 7% of those employers who responded said that the accommodation resulted in an ongoing annual cost to the company. So already we're narrowing down pretty quickly how many accommodations cost nothing. If we think about those one-time cost, that 43% there in the middle, the median one-time cost expenditure reported by an employer was $300. So really not a huge cost there for the one-time expenditure on an accommodation. And then in that 7% with ongoing accommodation costs, there was a median annual cost of $3,750. And again, that's the median cost. And that might sound like a larger number, but obviously want to emphasize you're talking about 7%. So a real minority of these employers had that ongoing accommodation cost that averaged out to 3,700. But if you also think about what it costs for you to recruit or right, seek out replacing employees, SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, estimated that the average cost per hire was $4,700. But many employers that were a part of SHRM's study here estimated that the total cost to hire a new employee can be up to 3 or 4 times the position's salary when you considered hard and soft costs, right? All of you, or most of you, are business leaders. You might be hiring managers or work in HR. You know just how much work goes into posting and reviewing and interviewing and training and bringing in new employees for positions. So when we think about that minority of accommodations back here that cost 3,700, that median cost is still $1,000 less than the average cost to hire somebody new, right? And I think importantly, the second bullet point here, statistically, disabled employees tend to stay at jobs longer, meaning that you'll save money in the long run by not replacing staff. So again, even if we think about and focus on that minority of population where it's going to be an annual cost, um, thinking about the savings of retaining a qualified, skilled worker who wants to work with you and is loyal to your position, in the long run may actually end up saving you money of having to replace and rehire people at regular intervals. So we'll talk here now about Title III, which is our public accommodations. And so public accommodation is a term of art here in the ADA that really means any public space. Um, this is, again, a non-exhaustive list, but this covers your stores, theaters, like movie theaters, or where you go to see a play or a symphony or something like that. Restaurants, hotels, shopping malls, bars, doctor's offices, dentist offices, recreational facilities, other businesses. So think of your spaces here that are open to the public. Anywhere that a member of the public could go into is probably going to fall under that Title III application of the ADA. So a lot of you who are small business owners or business owners, if your business is open to the public, which I suspect it is, you would be covered here under Title III. And I should refer back to Title I, right? I mentioned Title I of the anti-employment discrimination only applied to places with 15 or more employees. Title III does not have such a requirement. So Title III covers any public accommodation, regardless of how many people you have working in your business, regardless of how big or small your company is. And so Title III not only focuses on the accessible physical accessibility features, I should say, like your parking spaces, your entrances, door frames, bathrooms, right? Think of anything that's in your physical brick and mortar shop. And again, we could spend a lot of time going reg by reg through this of how wide things have to be, how high things have to be. I'll show you some resources that are really easy to get to after this, so you can do that with your own location. You can also reach out to us at the Harkin Institute if you have questions about this. I'm actually taking a group of some of our student workers today to go do an assessment for a small business to measure their work site and look at the physical accessibility and help give recommendations of what that business might want to do to be a little bit more accessible. But know that accessibility for a public accommodation is not just this physical accessibility, but also communication. You have to think about how your business could effectively communicate with a customer who has a disability. And again, this is really going to be specific to what your business does and the disability or the individual in question, because there could be very different standards for effective communication depending on what your business is, right? So I think an example that we use a lot in this space is, let's say that you run a bookshop, right? You have a bookstore. If a deaf person comes into your bookstore and is looking for a specific title, it may be effective communication for you, if you don't know sign language, for you and that customer to write back and forth on Post-it notes. I am looking for this book. I can help you. The book is over here on this shelf. Like, that might be an effective way to communicate with a deaf customer in a bookstore looking for a title. But I would not say that that's an effective way to communicate with a deaf person if you run a doctor's office, right? When it comes to something like explaining medical care or treatment, right? Passing Post-its back and forth is very likely to not be an effective and probably a dangerous way to communicate with someone to make sure that they understand what's going on with their medical care. And so again, I can't get into a whole lot of specifics. I don't know who's all here, but happy to talk about this in questions or go into some of these topics a little bit later. But just know that accessibility under the public accommodation is not just physical, but you should be prepared and have ways to think about effective communication as well. And I think something else that gets left behind is digital accessibility. Is your website and social media accessible as well? Later on in the next couple slides, I'll talk a little bit about digital accessibility. For our Title II people who are here, our state and government or federal government, state and local federal government people here under Title II, just earlier this month, the Department of Justice released new regulations around digital accessibility for government entities. And so, I think for small business owners, it behooves you to get in front of this as well and make sure that you are having spaces be accessible. A lot of companies, have been sued and lose because their website is not accessible if they're selling a product or selling tickets or selling something online. So it's a good idea to go through your website, go through social media, and think about how you could be more accessible there as well. And again, I'll give a little bit of some tips and tricks for digital accessibility here in just a minute. So we talked a lot about these physical accessibility features. And again, this is not the first time I've given a presentation like this, and I often get a question about how expensive this is, or you're a small business and you can't afford to make all of these corrections and repairs and fix up your business. But fortunately, there is a tax credit and a tax deduction available to help you get at some of these accommodations for your business. So the IRS has included a disability access credit. And again, I'm not an accountant. You'll want to talk to your own accountant and make sure that what you're doing qualifies. But Section 44 is what you want to ask them about of the disabled access credit. And so if your business has 30 or fewer full-time employees with a total revenue of $1 million or less in the previous tax year, eligible expenses may include the cost of undertaking barrier removal, alterations, improve accessibility, provide sign language interpreters, making material available in formats like Braille, audio tape, large print, right? Some of those communication accessibility things that I just mentioned there. And so again, if you're a small business owner on this call and you have fewer than 30 full-time employees and less than $1 million in revenue from the last tax year, you might be able to get credits for some of these accessibility features. And Section 190 of the IRS code provides a tax deduction for businesses of all sizes for costs incurred in removing architectural barriers in existing facilities or alteration. Currently, the maximum deduction is $15,000 per year. About every cycle, we have a new bill introduced that tries to increase that to make it even easier for businesses to make spaces accessible. But think about what you and your business could do for $15,000 a year with a tax deduction here. So again, we put some requirements on businesses, but we try to provide some pathways that this is achievable for people to bring in those extra customers and bring those populations in that you might not be serving. The other piece I want to talk about here is we focused a lot on how you can be accommodating for clients, for customers with disabilities, how to include those people in your business. But we want to think about inclusive recruitment for employees as well. You might be thinking about hiring people with disabilities, right? A good way to attract customers and their families with disabilities is to have disabled employees who know this experience, who can speak to that, who have the lived experience of disability, know what people are looking for, and that might be relatable to some of these customers, right? A lot of times we like to go into a business and see people that we relate to, see people that we feel like could understand us, or that we could talk to about whatever we're trying to buy, right? If we feel like they might have a shared experience in something like that. So there's a lot of resources out there to help you recruit and accommodate and retain people with disabilities. I have a QR code here on the right-hand side of the screen. So if you're at your desk or at home, you can just take out your smartphone right now and scan that QR code. This will take you to a small business toolkit that we have made here at the Harkin Institute to help small businesses in addressing these, I don't even want to say these issues, these opportunities, right? Hopefully from this presentation, you've seen how many more people with disabilities you want to hire and include in your business. So scan that QR code to see our toolkit that can help you get there. There's a lot of opportunities in our community for you to work with to recruit people. So Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation Services, or IVRS, sometimes just called VR, is a state agency that is set up to help disabled Iowans find employment, and they can often help with job coaching, sometimes transportation, training, other services. So the next time you have an open job posting, think about reaching out to IVRS, to Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation Services, and seeing who they have in their program who's looking for work, because you might find a really qualified person with a disability in your community looking for employment that would be a good fit. You can also work with the Iowa Department of the Blind, community providers. I see we have something. Oh, thank you, Ashley, has put the link to the toolkit in the chat. So if the QR code is not your preferred way, you can pull up the link. Thank you, Ashley. So I mentioned IVRS. There's also the Iowa Department for the Blind. There are community providers, right? Hopefully we have people today from all over the state of Iowa. Know that IVRS and Iowa Department for the Blind cover the state, but there are also providers in your local community that you could reach out to as well. There are employment networks, the Iowa Association of Supported Employment, or APSE, Iowa Works. You can reach out to any of these organizations to recruit, accommodate, retain a skilled employee with a disability. And again, check out either at the link in the chat or at the QR code, the toolkit that we created at the Harkin Institute to help you access those resources. I want to talk a little bit about disability as part of DEI. I know that sometimes this can be a little bit controversial topic, but we have to think about how disability fits into diversity, equity, and inclusion. Um, every one of us, every person on this call will experience a disability at some point in our life. So if you are not lucky enough to have a disability right now, you will have one at some point, whether by illness or accident or old age, just by living, we all develop disabilities at some point. So know that this isn't just about those people if you don't currently have a disability. This is also about you, right? You likely want to stay in a job or stay in your place of business as long as you are able to work. And having an inclusive, accessible environment allows you as an employer or as a business owner to stay in your own business as well. As we've talked about earlier, employers underestimate what percentage of their workforce has disabilities. So we have that 25%, that quarter of US has some type of disability. If we ask employers, they typically estimate somewhere between 4 and 7%. So again, you probably have employees or friends, neighbors, people in your community that have disabilities that you're not aware of. And so these movements towards accessibility and accommodations are also beneficial to those people as well. Again, to make them feel comfortable and included in the workplace, to stay there a long time, right? You don't want to constantly have to be replacing somebody when you could provide a simple accommodation and they just haven't brought that up in the workplace yet. A lot of employees with disabilities reported lower feelings of inclusion at work, not just when compared to coworkers without disabilities, but when compared to other groups that are typically included in these DEI initiatives. So if you're part of a larger corporation, you might have employee resource groups. You might have groups for women, LGBTQ employees, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so, again, people with disabilities who intersect with all of these identities as well often feel like we're less included in the workplace and don't get the same focus and attention as other marginalized groups. So if you are working on inclusion in the workplace, make sure that disability is a part of that. And then to this final bullet point here, disability cuts across all of those other groups as well, right? I have a disability. I am not just a disability in a vacuum, right? I have an age, a race, a gender, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, employment status, where we live, income levels, all these other demographics intersect with disability as well. So when you are inclusive of disability, you are necessarily cutting across all of these other populations, which again, for small business owners, is good, right? You want as many people as possible accessing your business. Here's some of our information about digital accessibility that I mentioned we would provide here. So I've got these 4 accessibility principles. And again, if you want to have a deeper conversation about this, feel free to reach out. We have a graphic design and digital accessibility specialist on staff here at the Harkin Institute, who I know would be happy to talk to businesses and help talk through what some of this digital accessibility means. 4 accessibility principles that I list here are that things are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So perceivable is that people can perceive content through at least one of their senses. So the example I give is that people who are blind often use screen reading software to read a web page. I think about this for social media as well. Right? If you registered for this talk, you probably saw somewhere on social media a really nice graphic that the Secretary of State's office made of a computer with icons and the Secretary of State logo with the time and the date and asking you to to join, the Secretary of State's office provided what's called alt text on that image. And so for someone who's blind, if you don't have alt text and they're going through social media, right, they're on LinkedIn or wherever we shared this, all you're going to hear from a screen reader is that there is an image or an icon, and you're missing all of that information. But when you have the alt text, it will tell you what the image is, what time the event is. So think about that with social media, right? You're probably sharing your booth at the farmer's market and what day and time you'll be there, or you have some type of open house or a new product, sidewalk sale, or whatever you're advertising. If you've created a really nice graphic that advertises that, make sure that you're putting that information from the graphic in alt text on social media or in the text of the post, so that people can read that. Think about using captions on videos. If you're going to post a small commercial or something like that, having captions, sign language, things like that. And again, something like captions, right, is beneficial to all kinds of people. It's beneficial if you are deaf or hard of hearing. It's beneficial if you're not a native English speaker and have a hard time understanding it. Or, if you're scrolling through your phone, and you've got it on mute and you just see the captions on a video, right? You can still have access to what's going on in the commercial. So think about some of these things in terms of reaching out to people broadly. If it benefits disabled people, it often benefits every other type of person as well. Operable means that people can use interactive elements no matter what they're interacting with in the content. So for example, people who can't use their hands can use click buttons or dictation software to navigate. Think about having content that is understandable, the third principle here, that people can understand the content and how to use it. So for example, people using a device or assistive technology should be able to identify links, understand what happens when they click them. Think about using vocabulary or terms that are broadly understood by people instead of maybe the fanciest vocabulary, using something straightforward and simple to make sure that it's understandable for people. And robust, that people can use websites on any device or any type of assistive technology. So if you, again, are using social media or have a web store or storefront, making sure that it's accessible across, whether someone's using it on mobile or a tablet or a desktop or what have you, make sure that you've gone through different accessibility checks for the different formats that you might have that information. I'm sharing some important resources here. So we have hyperlinks as well as QR codes. So again, to the small business toolkit that we created at the Institute, we have the hyperlink there. I know Ashley already put it in the chat. And then the QR code to the left of your screen is our small business toolkit. The middle bullet point and middle QR code is for the ADA primer for small businesses. This is a government created resource from ada.gov, focused specifically on Title III, those public accommodations. So again, I'll leave this slide up for a minute. You will want to click on the link. I think Ashley has just put it in yep, Ashley has added the links to the chat, so you don't have to pull those off the screen, but you can use the QR code. So I would definitely recommend this primer for small businesses. Goes into much more detail about the actual regulations on having the business be accessible. And then the third bullet point and the QR code all the way to the right here is a resource for the Great Plains ADA Center. So again, I'm assuming if you're watching this, you are based in Iowa, which means that our ADA Center is the Great Plains ADA Center. If you are not in Iowa and you're based in the United States, you have a different ADA Center, and you can either search for that, or if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to point you in their direction. But the Great Plains ADA Center is also a really good resource for businesses about ADA accommodations, accessibility resources. A lot of their services are also provided free of charge. They are a government-funded group to help people become more accessible. And also on the screen here, most important, right? You all have your CLE code for today. So if you have made it this far in talking and listening with me, our CLE code is 408922. Again, that's 408922. It's up here on the screen in the blue box. And this CLE has been approved for 1 hour and 15 minutes or 1.25 hours of diversity CLE. So make sure that you register this, get your diversity CLE for all the attorneys that we have watching here. And I'll pause so that you can pull these resources or jot down the CLE code. And I'll take a drink of water. Okay. And then finally, right, I want to make sure that we all stay connected. So here is about every way that you can connect with the Harkin Institute and engage with our programming. So as you'll see, you can go to our website and sign up for our newsletter, get on our email list. We also have Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Please follow us there so you can keep track of presentations and events that we have coming. Some events to be aware of: if you like getting CLE credit from the Harkin Institute, you will want to check out our continuing education series that we are running. We will be announcing our May program very soon, but we had a CLE back in March and one in April that we'll have up on our YouTube. And this is a continuing CLE series, so make sure you check that schedule to continue to get CLEs. As an attorney, I know how important it is to get them, especially before we all get under that crunch time at the end of the year. And our most recent program that we hope you will join us with is next Tuesday, April 30th. We have our annual Retirement Security Symposium. And this year's theme is navigating the journey to financial wellness. So registration is still open. I believe it is open through tomorrow. So again, you can scan the QR code at the bottom of this slide or go to our website to register for our Retirement Security Symposium. And please follow us on social media, and we want to see you at some future activities. Almost everything we do at the Institute is hybrid as well, and so we provide captioning ASL, so wherever you are in the state, you should be able to join our activities. So I'll just pause here to make sure that people have access to the QR code, and I'm sure you're all running to social media to follow us. Ashley's put our website in the chat as well. I'll pause here. Go ahead and sign up for our Retirement Security Symposium. I'll wait a minute for you guys to get registered for that. Okay, and with that, that brings me to the end of the formal presentation and the time to really focus on questions. So we have the Q&A. If there are some questions that you have, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and Ashley and I will go through them.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. It was a ton of really helpful information, super interesting and beneficial. And I agree with you. I did not realize that the ADA, I know a lot of people would find that interesting, that the ADA extends to people perceived to have a disability as well. So thank you for diving into that. I did have a question really quick that was sent to me privately, kind of asking just what is CLE. So CLE stands for Continuing Legal Education Credit. So that is going to be a credit for attorneys that are members of the Bar Association. So that is what that means. Good question. And again, oh, looks like we have one here. Perfect. Okay. I'm just going to say, make sure you're using the Q&A chat thing. So looks like we have one here. Daniel, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, so the question is there any disability rights legislation that we should be aware of, either federal or state? I mean, it's a very broad question. Of course, I will say yes. There are a lot of disability bills at the state level. And I know we have some people here that have joined us that could also speak to some of those. But you're going to want to follow some of the disability bills that are happening in our state legislature. I think specifically the Work Without Worry bill that's been put forward is going to affect people with disabilities. And again, the Institute is nonpartisan. We don't lobby, but if you're interested in disability employment, that's one to keep a lookout for and see how it develops. Federally, there are a lot of laws constantly being or bills, I should say, being introduced around sub-minimum wage, as well as income and asset limits at the federal level as well. And so those are things that do affect people with disabilities being able to access the workforce. We hear pretty regularly from some very large employers, some of your, think about your Fortune 100 companies that will reach out to us at the Institute and say, we saw your presentation, we went to an event, we hired people with disabilities, and they're great. They're really good workers. Last year, we went to promote them, and they turned down a promotion. And when we asked them why, it was because under their benefits, they're only able to make a certain amount of money before they lose their benefits. And so we have asset and income limits on benefits recipients with disabilities that actually prevent them from being fully employed, from fully engaging in work. And so I think that's the legislation that we are following the most at the state and federal level is, right, any disabled person who wants to work should be encouraged and enabled to work. And having income and asset limits that prevent people from finding work just does not make sense to me. I think, again, also wanting to follow sub-minimum wage, there's a movement now to phase that out federally. Some states have already gotten rid of sub-minimum wage. Iowa has not. We still have 14C certificate holders in the state of Iowa, meaning that employers can pay employees with disabilities significantly below minimum wage, sometimes 20 cents an hour, 40 cents an hour, $1 an hour. So that's other legislation that you may want to follow at the state and federal level as well. Another attendee mentions or comments you may want to mention the Iowa Civil Rights Act covers disability discrimination for employers with 4 or more employees. Thank you for pointing that out. I guess I've been focusing on the ADA, but that's also good to know. And then another person asks, where can we find information on physical specifications for locations to help accommodate people with physical disabilities, such as hallway widths, counters, heights, restroom grab bars, etc.? So these are going to be your ADA Amendments Act architectural guidelines. And so if I can also follow up with Ashley with a link, but if you search for the 2010 ADA architectural regulations or architectural guidelines, you'll be able to find some really great checklists. Actually, they'll walk you through bathrooms, soda fountain heights, everything that you need to do. And those are the 2010 regulations. So you should be able to find those that way.
Some great questions. And yeah, feel free to follow up with me, Daniel, on that, and I can provide a link for people when I send that follow-up email. Kind of leave it open and see if anyone has any other questions. But while we're waiting for that, I thought of a few. So I know that we kind of talked about like the benefits for like business owners of getting people with disabilities to be a member of their business. So I was wondering if you, Daniel, if you had studies on like qualities of people with disabilities as employees and or as business owners. I know that we know that we are a very resilient and innovative community, especially since, we saw those products mentioned earlier, but I wanted to kind of get your perspective on that and see if there were any specific studies that kind of stuck out to you there.
Yeah, I mean, one that stands out, I referenced on an earlier slide about, I believe the hyperlink was in that slide too, about how employees with disabilities have lower turnover when they're accommodated and when we have a positive experience in the workplace, we stay longer. That same study has a lot of information about, right, the innovative power of people with disabilities, bringing creative ideas, bringing creative inventions and things like that. And I think that SHRM report that I mentioned as well also has really interesting information about the cost savings for employers when you hire people with disabilities because of that reduction of turnover and constantly recruiting. I would say the other thing that I always think about is I mean, unfortunately, right, people with disabilities face a lot of discrimination in the workplace in getting hired because of these old stereotypes and misunderstandings, which cause a lot of people with disabilities to become small business owners and entrepreneurs. And so, and people in the audience today, you might be a disabled small business owner or entrepreneur, and so think about those resources. Um, but yeah, I just always highlight that when you have a disability and you're living in a world that was not designed or made for you, you necessarily have to be creative and a problem solver by default. That's just kind of our lived experience of navigating a world and a society that is not considered you, right? And so if you want employers or employees, I'm sorry, that are creative thinking, problem solvers, dedicated, hardworking, which I think every employer, right? Those are some characteristics that you want. You should look toward employees with disabilities. And it brings that unique perspective, like other forms of diversity, right? When you have different people in the room, you'll approach things differently and you'll get ideas that you never would have thought of. Um, that makes your business, makes your product, makes everything better to have a little bit different perspective.
I totally agree, and thank you for diving into that. I just wanted to, yeah, kind of hear about like the more like personality type qualities. So I appreciate all the information that you provided about both the like rate of like staying at a place, but also kind of diving into that. So thank you for letting me ask you that, and really good answer, and it holds true. I know. Um, so let's see if we have any. Looks like right now we might not have anything else in the chat. But I know, I guess I have another one, unless someone else has one. Um, I know we mentioned, oh, looks like we have one. Okay. I'll let you take that one, Daniel.
Sure. So the question is, how do vocational rehab and employment networks support potential employees? Yeah, great question. So I mentioned that Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation Services um, helps disabled job seekers in a variety of ways. So I know some VR counselors who operate as job coaches. So they will go with an employee to the job site and work beside them, help with training. It's not meant to be a uh, permanent function, but it's certainly when we all start new jobs, you might need a little bit more hands-on training. And so a VR counselor could come as a job coach and go with you to a site, and help you develop work plans, flows, step-by-step guides, task analysis, that type of work. VR often provides training to job seekers who need certain skills to be competitive. They also work with employers to think about what skills you actually need in a position, and is there a way that a disabled job applicant might have that skill set in a non-traditional way, right? Not everyone will have a 2 year or 4 year degree, but might have work experience that gives them some type of expertise. Those are kind of the big ones that come to mind. But the training, job coaching, support can be really beneficial for job seekers with disabilities. And many of these services are available for young people with disabilities as well. In Iowa, right, transition planning for high school students starts at 14. VR counselors often get looped in around 16 years old to really prepare disabled students to be successful in the employment sphere when they graduate. Okay, we have another question. Are there ways to make my hiring process more inclusive and accessible? Yes. So I mentioned, right, reaching out to some of those organizations when you post a job, right? When you post a new position on your website, making sure that you have disability organizations, whether it's, something like the Harkin Institute or Disability Rights Iowa or Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation. Make sure that you're sharing those postings with those groups. You also often will have disability affinity groups or community groups. For example, I know at Drake University, we have a disability student and faculty coalition. You could share it with that group. A lot of campuses across Iowa have that as well. So you could get some soon-to-be graduates with disabilities. But again, there's that recruitment side, and then you have to make sure that when a disabled applicant goes to your website for that job posting, it's accessible, right? Have you gone through the screen reading? And is it accurate, right? I see a lot of job postings that still say things like must be able to lift 25 pounds or, stand for a certain amount of time. And there are certainly some jobs where that is necessary, right? Um, I mean, I guess I don't typically professionally lift 25 pounds. So that would not be a job requirement, but I've applied for jobs that have that. So make sure that what you're posting actually has the essential functions and doesn't have unnecessary tasks that might weed out people with disabilities. Because you'll have disabled applicants who'd be really qualified, but may not apply because they see something like, you know, lifting 25 pounds. And if you don't really need that position to do that, you're missing out on that applicant. It's also good in your job posting to have verbiage that shows that people with disabilities are encouraged to apply. The EEOC has some really good guidance on this. Ashley, I can send you that link as well, but you are allowed to say people with disabilities are encouraged to apply. And that lets us know that you see value in recruiting us. It goes a step beyond the boilerplate, like we promise not to discriminate against you based on race, religion, national origin. Right, saying we promise to follow the law and not discriminate against you doesn't exactly make you feel like you would be a valuable applicant, but saying something like, applicants with disabilities and from other diverse backgrounds are encouraged to apply. And I would say also importantly, have information about accommodations for your hiring process in that posting as well. So some people may need accommodations while they are applying. And having language that says, for accommodations in the hiring process, please contact blank at company.hr.com or whatever your email is. And I don't know, sometimes I see companies list examples. So, if you need accommodations in the job application process, like large print materials, ASL interpretation, a virtual interview, questions ahead of time, etc., contact, HR at company.com. So I think things like that make sure that when you have a disabled applicant coming to you, that they feel confident that they will be considered and valued in that workplace. I think we have just 1 minute left.
Those are really great questions. I know, Daniel, you kind of covered some of the incentives. I don't know if you want to take that one really quickly or if you would prefer to maybe follow up with me on that and I can send out some
I see. Yes,
information.
sorry, there's another question. Are there incentives to encourage businesses to hire people with disabilities? So I mentioned some of those tax credits and opportunities for making spaces more accessible. Yeah, I think with us being out of time, I can send some other resources because depending on, again, the type of business and type of population, there might be some other benefits that would qualify for you. But I think, as I talked about earlier, right, you should want people with disabilities there because you should want a motivated, skilled workforce that customers, right, can relate to and connect with. So I think with us running out of time, unfortunately, that's probably the the best answer that I can give. But thank you all for hanging on for this hour and 15 minutes. Make sure you connect with us, use those resources, and get your CLE credit. And thank you, Ashley and Secretary Pate and the Secretary of State's office for inviting me to have this talk. it was a joy talking to everybody today.
Yeah, thank you. And again, to echo what Daniel said, thank you all for joining us. And thank you to Daniel again for your wonderful presentation. The toolkit is a really wonderful resource. I've read through it. It is part of what inspired me to reach out to the Harkin Institute. So I would encourage everyone to check that out. And I'll send out an email with these resources as well as the webinar feedback survey. So please feel free to fill that out. That's really helpful to us. Again, if you need the CLE number again, it is 408922. So keep an eye out for that follow-up email. And then later on, I'll send you an additional follow-up email with the link to the webinar recording. And thank you all. Appreciate your time. And thanks, Daniel.
Hey, everybody.